The automatic doors hadn't finished opening when she walked through them. A woman, blonde hair plastered dark with rain, medical scrubs soaked through, gray turning black where someone else's blood had spread across her left shoulder, down her sleeve, pooling at her collar. She wasn't walking so much as carrying. A soldier, 200 pounds of dead weight, draped across her shoulders in a fireman's carry, his head lolling, one arm dangling loose. Behind her, a Belgian Malinois moved in total silence. No collar jingling, no panting, just four paws and locked eyes, scanning every person in that lobby like each one was a potential threat. The emergency ward at Cascade Valley Medical Center in Harlow, Montana, went absolutely quiet. Then the man in the suit stepped forward. "Stop right there. Who are you? You don't work here." The woman didn't look at him. She looked at the nearest trauma bay and started walking toward it. That decision, that single quiet refusal to explain herself, would cost her everything in the next 10 minutes and save 11 lives before midnight. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better, stay until the end. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The rain had been falling since 4 in the afternoon, the kind of steady mountain rain that didn't come with thunder or drama. Just a gray curtain that turned the roads into mirrors and made Harlow, Montana feel like the last town before the edge of the world. Nora Vasquez had been driving for 6 hours. She hadn't planned to stop in Harlow. She hadn't planned much of anything, which was the point. After 14 months back in civilian life, planning felt like a language she'd half forgotten. She could recognize the shape of it, could almost speak it when she had to. But it didn't come naturally anymore. What came naturally was movement. The truck, Ranger in the back seat, the next stretch of highway. She'd taken the Harlow exit because Ranger needed water and her gas gauge was sitting at a quarter tank and the sign said the next services were 41 miles ahead. That was it. No instinct, no pull, just logistics, the way she still processed most decisions. What's needed? What's available? What's the most efficient path between the two? She stopped at a gas station on the edge of town, filled the tank while Ranger drank from a bowl she kept in the bed of the truck, and that's when she heard it. Not heard exactly, felt. The particular quality of silence that follows a sound the human ear barely catches. A concussive pressure somewhere to the north, muffled by distance and rain and the ridge of mountains that cupped Harlow on 3 sides. She'd felt that particular vibration in her sternum before, in places that didn't make it onto the maps that civilians carried. She stood beside the pump with her hand still on the nozzle and tilted her head slightly. Ranger had gone still in the truck bed, ears up, eyes north. She replaced the nozzle, capped the tank, and got back in the truck. She told herself she was just going to drive past. The military convoy had taken Route 9 through the mountain pass. 3 vehicles, standard configuration, running lights only because of the weather. Nora saw the first signs from a quarter-mile out. Red flares burning in the road, rain hissing off the magnesium, 1 vehicle on its side in the drainage ditch. The second vehicle had veered hard left and crumpled against the rock face. Only the third had stopped intact, and its doors were already open, soldiers moving in the wet darkness. She pulled over without thinking about it. Later, she would struggle to explain that, not to investigators or to anyone official, to herself, alone in a motel room 3 days later, turning it over like a stone she kept finding in her pocket. She had no obligation. She was out. 14 months out, honorable discharge, sealed file, done. She owed that convoy nothing, but the body doesn't negotiate with logic under pressure. The body remembers what it knows. She was out of the truck before she'd made a conscious decision to get out. Ranger, heel. He was beside her instantly, matching her pace as she moved through the rain toward the flares. A young specialist, she pegged him as 20, maybe 21, his rank tab dark with water, turned and raised his rifle out of instinct when she appeared from the darkness. "Whoa, civilian, hands." "I'm not a threat." She kept her hands visible, kept walking. "Who's your highest ranking?" "Lady, stop right there. Your vehicle is on its side and somebody in that ditch is not moving. I need you to lower that rifle and tell me who's giving orders right now." He hesitated. The rifle stayed up another 2 seconds. Then a voice from the direction of the overturned vehicle called out, rough and strained, "Let her through." The soldier with the rifle stepped aside. The man who'd called out was a staff sergeant, mid-30s, one hand pressed against his own side, the other braced against the undercarriage of the overturned vehicle. He had the controlled face of someone managing pain by sheer compartmentalization, jaw set, breathing shallow and deliberate, eyes clear. "You medical?" he asked. "Yes." "How medical?" "Enough." "What happened?" "Roadway was compromised. Rockfall, maybe rigged. We're still determining. First vehicle took the worst of it. I've got one critical in the ditch, 2 walking wounded, one I can't account for." "Your injury?" She was already moving past him toward the ditch. "Fractured ribs, probably. I'm mobile." "Stay that way. Do you have a trauma kit in the operational vehicle?" 2, standard issue." "Get them both out." She half slid down the wet embankment into the ditch and found the critical casualty in the darkness. A soldier, male, late 20s, helmet cracked and displaced, unconscious. Her hands moved before her eyes, fully adjusted. Airway first. She cleared it with 2 fingers, tilted his head, confirmed breathing. Shallow, but present. Pulse in the carotid. Weak, irregular. The real problem was his left leg. She didn't let herself react to it. Reaction takes time, and time was what this man didn't have. "I need a tourniquet and I need light," she said. A flashlight came down from above. Then the trauma kit. Then the specialist who'd had the rifle was in the ditch beside her, following instructions she gave in clipped half sentences, and she worked without stopping for 22 minutes in the rain and the dark and the cold until the bleeding was controlled and the man was stabilized enough to move. "We're transporting him," she said, climbing out of the ditch. "Nearest trauma facility." "That's Cascade Valley," the staff sergeant said. He was watching her with an expression she recognized, the look people got when they'd revised their assessment of someone mid-conversation and weren't sure whether to acknowledge it. 12 minutes from here." "Then we go now." "Who can drive?" "I can." "Can you actually drive, or are you going to pass out on me?" Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile. "I can drive." "Then let's move." She carried the critical soldier herself, not because there wasn't help available, but because the safest way to move him across the unstable ground and into the surviving vehicle required a single person who understood exactly where his injuries were and how his body needed to be supported. She'd done this before. She knew how to carry a man without jarring the injuries that would kill him. Ranger moved at her left side the entire way. Cascade Valley Medical Center was newer than it looked from the outside. The facade was standard mountain town practical. Brick and rain-stained concrete, a covered ambulance bay, signage lit in the particular blue-white of institutional fluorescence. Inside, if you knew the building, it was well-equipped. 2 trauma bays, a surgical suite, a staff of 43, which was a reasonable number for a regional facility serving the valley's population and the stretch of highway that cut through it. What it wasn't built for was what walked through its emergency entrance at 8:47 on a Tuesday night. The lobby was mid-shift quiet. A woman with a child in her lap, 2 older men near the windows, a security guard on his phone near the reception desk. The desk itself was manned by a triage nurse named Sandra, who had been in this building for 11 years and thought she'd seen most categories of arrival. She looked up when the automatic doors opened. The woman who walked in was maybe 30. Hard to determine precisely because everything about her was obscured by rain and exhaustion and the man across her shoulders. The scrubs she wore, gray, institutional, were saturated with blood from the left shoulder to the hem. Her hair had given up any structure and hung in pale strands across her face. Behind her, a dog that looked like it had been built in a laboratory to be maximally intimidating moved with the kind of controlled quiet that made Sandra's hand instinctively reach for her phone. "I need a trauma bay," the woman said. Her voice was even, not calm in the way of someone who wasn't scared, calm in the way of someone who'd decided that being scared was a luxury the moment didn't allow. GSW and blunt force to the lower extremity, blood loss managed in the field, vitals unstable. I need the bay now. Sandra was already reaching for the intercom when the other voice cut across the lobby. "Hold on." Malcolm Strick moved fast for a man in dress shoes on a polished floor. He was the hospital's administrative director. 51, silver-templed. The kind of man whose suit fit well enough that you noticed the suit before you noticed the man. He'd been in the building late for a contractor meeting, and he had a particular way of inserting himself into situations that didn't require him, which had been pointed out to him by 3 different HR processes over the past 2 years without measurable effect. He positioned himself between the woman and the hallway that led to the trauma bays. "This is a restricted area," he said. "Staff and authorized. I'm aware of what this area is." She didn't slow down. "Move." Strick's face changed in the way faces do when someone doesn't respond to authority the way authority expects. A tightening around the eyes. A slight forward shift of the shoulders. "You are not staff here. You are not in proper identification. You are not—" "This man will die in the next few minutes without intervention. I have controlled external hemorrhage, but his pressure is dropping. You have a trauma bay 20 feet away." She looked at him directly. Not angry, not pleading, just direct, in the way that people are direct when they've stopped caring about the social negotiation and started caring only about the outcome. "Get out of my way!" The lobby had gone entirely silent. Strick looked at the security guard. "Get her out of here." The guard, a man named Pete, who had worked hospital security for 6 years and had a genuine instinct for reading situations, hesitated. He looked at the woman. He looked at the soldier. He looked at the dog, which had turned its head very slightly to track him. "Sir." "Now, Pete?" Pete took a step forward. Ranger didn't growl, didn't bare his teeth. He simply repositioned himself with the subtle geometry of a dog that has been trained to make itself a barrier, planting his weight in a way that said, "This is as far as you go without making a single sound." Pete stopped. And in that fractional pause, Sandra at the desk made a decision that she would later describe as the most straightforward call she'd made in 11 years. She picked up the intercom and said, "Trauma Bay 1, incoming critical, Trauma Bay 1. The hallway behind Strick flooded with motion. 2 nurses came first, then a resident named Marcus, who was 3 months out of his fellowship and still had the specific anxiety of someone who'd learned everything in theory and was now learning it again in practice. He took one look at the incoming patient, the pallor, the crude tourniquet that had saved his life, the careful way the woman was maintaining his airway even while carrying him, and said, "Bay 1, let's go, let's go." Strick stepped back, not because he'd changed his mind, because the corridor had filled with people moving past him, and standing in the middle of a moving corridor is simply not a viable position. Nora laid the soldier down on the bay table with precision. Not gently, exactly, because gentle isn't the priority, positioning is the priority. And immediately began transferring verbal information to Marcus. Mechanism of injury, interventions performed, estimated blood loss, time elapsed, vitals as last checked. She spoke in the compressed shorthand of medical personnel transferring a patient, which is a different language than civilian speech. Denser, faster, stripped of everything that isn't immediately actionable. Marcus was keeping up. Barely, but keeping up. The nurses were already moving. And from the doorway of the trauma bay, Malcolm Strick watched with an expression that had curdled from authority into something more complicated and harder to name. She stayed in the bay for 11 minutes, long enough to confirm the transfer of care was solid, that Marcus had everything he needed and understood what he had, that the nurses weren't going to be caught off guard by the secondary presentation that was developing in the soldier's chest. She'd felt the beginning of it during transport, the subtle asymmetry of his breathing that could mean something was building. "Watch his breath sounds on the left," she said to the nurse nearest the head of the bed. "Every 10 minutes. Got it." She stepped back, turned around. Strick was in the doorway. Behind him were 2 security guards, not Pete, who had apparently disqualified himself from this particular assignment, and another man she hadn't seen before. This one was taller, late 40s, the look of someone who managed things from a distance and didn't like being called to a floor. He had an administrator's lanyard and administrator's eyes, always calculating who had leverage and who didn't. "Ms. Strick started. "I'm not your concern right now." She moved toward the doorway. He didn't step aside. "The other 2 walking wounded from the convoy will be here in approximately 7 minutes. Your staff needs to be ready for them. We have a process for... Your process is designed for a normal Tuesday night. This isn't a normal Tuesday night. She was close enough now that the gap between them was not a comfortable distance. She didn't push into it. She just stood there calmly and let him feel that she wasn't going to be moved. 2 additional casualties, mechanism of injury consistent with the first, one with probable rib fractures and internal bruising, one with a laceration on the forearm that needs cleaning and closure. Neither is critical, but both need to be seen. Strick's jaw had gone tight in the way of a man absorbing information he resents needing. Your name, he said. Vasquez. Full name. Nora Vasquez. Do you have credentials, Ms. Vasquez? Are you licensed to practice in the state of Montana? She'd known this was coming, had known it from the moment she walked through the door, maybe from the moment she slid down into that ditch in the rain. It was the question that was always waiting at the other end of this kind of situation, the one that converted. Did it work into, were you allowed to do it? Which are 2 entirely different questions that should not be weighted the same way but always are, in rooms like this, by men like this. I'm not currently licensed in Montana, she said. Something moved through the hallway. The particular electricity of an audience that's been given permission to react. Strick's expression shifted. She watched him decide something. Then you performed unauthorized medical procedures on a patient in this facility. I performed emergency stabilization at the roadside, not in this facility. You walked into this trauma bay to transfer care. The patient was already in my custody. I transferred care to your resident. That is not unauthorized practice. She was right, and she could see that he knew she was right, which made his expression do something slightly unpleasant. There are people who accept being wrong and adjust, and people who know they're wrong and look for a different angle. Strick was the second type. You're in a restricted area without authorization, he said. You're going to come with security, and we're going to document this incident properly. You can document whatever you need to document, but not until that convoy has been fully processed. I'm not asking. I know. She looked at him for a moment longer than was comfortable, not as a challenge, just as an assessment, the way she'd learned to look at situations in environments where misreading someone cost you more than a social awkwardness. Then she looked at the 2 security guards, who both looked like they were recalculating their role in this scenario. Ranger was at her left side. He hadn't made a sound since they'd entered the building. He didn't make one now. He just stood there like a very deliberate piece of architecture. Fine, Nora said. She followed the security guards down the corridor. Strick fell in behind her, already on his phone. What she didn't know yet, what none of them knew yet, in the careful management of this administrative crisis in the hallway of a regional hospital, was that 4 miles north on Route 9, the remaining 2 vehicles of the convoy were not the only things moving toward Harlow. The security office was a room she'd been in variations of before. Fluorescent light, 1 table, chairs bolted to the wall, a camera in the corner. A place designed to make you aware that you were being observed, which was the whole point. Observation is pressure. She sat down. Ranger sat beside her. The second administrator, the taller one, whose lanyard read Director of Operations R. Calloway, sat across from her. Strick stood near the door. A third person had appeared from somewhere, a woman with a tablet who appeared to be documenting the conversation. Ms. Vasquez, Calloway began. He had the practiced calm of someone who'd run many of these conversations. We appreciate that you responded to what appears to have been an emergency situation. However, his phone rang. He looked at it, looked up, answered it. The conversation lasted 45 seconds. Nora watched his face change 3 times. He lowered the phone. There's been another incident on Route 9, he said, and his voice had changed in a specific way. The way voices change when a situation has expanded beyond what the speaker was prepared to manage. Strick turned from the door. What kind of incident? The convoy wasn't just a vehicle accident. The preliminary report is... Calloway paused. Armed engagement. Multiple casualties incoming. ETA 6 minutes. The silence in that room lasted perhaps 2 full seconds. Then every phone in the building started going off at once. Nora was on her feet before Calloway had finished his sentence. She was moving to the door before either of them processed that she was no longer sitting down. Ms. Vasquez, Strick started. How many trauma bays do you have operational right now? That's not. How many? Calloway answered. 2. Possibly 3 if we clear the observation ward. Clear it. You're going to need 3. She was already in the corridor. Where's your mass casualty supply cache? We're not. This isn't. Strick was following her, his voice tilting toward something between outrage and something else he wouldn't have wanted to name. You do not have authority in this building. She stopped, turned around, faced him. You're right, she said. I don't. So you make the calls. Tell your staff what needs to happen. But if you stand in this hallway for the next 30 seconds, deciding whether I have the right paperwork while soldiers are dying in transit, that's a choice you'll be explaining for the rest of your career. She turned back around. Where's the supply cache? Calloway pointed. She went. The first vehicles came through the ambulance bay at 9:04 p.m. Not 2 walking wounded, not what any of them had been briefed for. 3 military transport vehicles, 2 additional civilian vehicles that had apparently been swept into whatever had happened on Route 9, a count that was still being determined, but the initial visual estimate from the ambulance bay was somewhere between 9 and 13 casualties of varying severity. Marcus, the resident, had come out of Trauma Bay 1 when the first alert went through and now stood at the corridor junction, looking at the incoming wave with the expression of a man whose worst-case mental preparation had just been exceeded. Nora was already at the bay entrance. She wasn't in charge. She had no title, no badge, no authority that any document in that building would recognize. But she was the person at the junction who had been in this specific situation before, not a simulation of it, the thing itself. And when a system is overwhelmed, it tends to collapse toward whoever has an answer. Marcus. She said it the same way she'd said Ranger, heal, not a request. Triage at the door, you and me. Don't let anyone through until we've assessed. We need to know what's critical before anything comes inside. Okay. He said it fast, like a man grabbing a rope. Yeah, okay. Sandra? She raised her voice toward the desk without looking. I need you to hold the waiting room and keep that area clear. Family and bystanders stay on the other side of the line. Can you do that? Yes, Sandra said. Good. Strick was somewhere behind her. She could feel it, could almost hear the particular frequency of a man deciding whether he was going to intervene and calculating the cost. She didn't look back. She moved to the ambulance bay doors. The first gurney came through. She caught it. Her hands already knew what to do. Outside, in the rain, military vehicles were pulling up with their lights strobing red and white across the wet asphalt, and somewhere in the chaos of doors and shouts and running boots, a voice, clipped, commanding, completely at odds with the disorder around it, was saying something into a radio that Nora couldn't make out over the noise. Ranger pressed close to her left leg. She kept moving. Behind her, Strick had his phone out again, and whoever he was calling, whoever he thought was going to resolve this situation in his favor, was about to find out that the woman he'd tried to throw out of this building was the only reason any of the incoming casualties were going to make it to a bed tonight. He just didn't know it yet. And down the corridor in Trauma Bay 1, the soldier she'd carried through the rain had a heartbeat that a monitor was tracing in steady green peaks, alive, stable, breathing, because a woman with no lanyard and no badge and no explanation had decided that some things don't wait for permission. The ambulance bay doors swung open again, and whatever was on the other side of those doors was about to change every assumption in that building, including the ones Malcolm Strick had just finished making about who was in control. The second gurney came through before the first one was fully assessed. That was the thing about mass casualty events that no training simulation ever quite captured. The compression, the way time didn't slow down to accommodate you, the way the next problem arrived before you'd finished solving the current one, the way your hands had to keep moving even when your brain was still 3 steps behind. Nora had learned this in places she didn't talk about, in conditions that made a rain-soaked Montana hospital look like a controlled environment, and the knowledge lived in her body now rather than her mind, which meant she didn't have to think about it. She just moved. The second gurney held a soldier she pegged immediately as a traumatic brain injury presentation. Pupils uneven, one blown, one reactive, the particular stillness of someone whose body was present but whose brain was somewhere else entirely. She checked his airway with 2 fingers, noted the lack along his scalp that was bleeding freely and dramatically but was not the thing that was going to kill him, and called back to Marcus without turning around. TBI, Bay 2, get neurology on the phone now, not in 5 minutes. We don't have an on-call neuro, then get the closest one by phone and keep him stable until you figure that out. A pause. Then, okay? It wasn't confidence in his voice. It was something adjacent to it, the decision to act like confidence until the real thing arrived. She'd heard that particular tone before, in young medics on their first deployment, and it was actually a better sound than actual confidence because it meant the person knew they were out of their depth and had chosen to swim anyway. The third gurney was a civilian, a woman, 50s, civilian clothes, scalp bleeding, conscious and terrified, repeating a name that was probably someone she'd been with when whatever happened on Route 9 had happened. Ma'am? Nora put a hand on her shoulder. I need you to look at me. The woman's eyes found her face. What's your name? Diane. Diane Marsh. Diane. You're at the hospital. You're safe. Where does it hurt? My head, and I can't, my wrist. Is there anyone else in the vehicle you were in? Anyone who didn't make it out? The woman's face crumpled in a way that told Nora everything before she said anything. My husband. He was driving. I don't know where. We're going to find him. Can you walk? I think so. Then walk with this nurse. Right here. Her name is Sandra. And she's going to take care of you. She looked at Sandra, who had materialized at her left shoulder with the particular efficiency of a woman who had stopped waiting for instructions. Observation room, wrist x-ray, scalp closure when we have capacity. Non-critical, but keep eyes on her. Got it. The fourth gurney was the one that stopped her for a half second. Not because of the injury, though the injury was significant, tension pneumothorax developing, she could see it in the way his chest was moving, asymmetric, one side barely rising, trachea starting to deviate. The clock on this one measured in single-digit minutes. No, what stopped her was his age. He looked maybe 19. He had the unfinished face of someone who hadn't grown all the way into his own features yet. And he was conscious, and he was scared in the particular way that young soldiers are scared when they understand the situation well enough to know it's bad. She was already moving. Hey. She got close, put her face in his field of vision. Look at me. I'm going to help you breathe. You have to stay very still. Am I? He couldn't finish the sentence. You're going to be fine, but I need you to hold still for 30 seconds. She looked at the nearest nurse, a man named Darius, who she'd identified in the first 4 minutes as the person on this floor who moved fastest and asked the fewest unnecessary questions. 14-gauge chest decompression. Now. Darius was already moving. You're not authorized. Strick's voice from somewhere behind her, with the specific strained quality of a man who keeps saying the same thing and keeps watching it not work. She didn't answer him. She kept her eyes on the soldier. What's your name? Reyes. Reyes, 20 seconds now. Hold very still. She performed the needle decompression with the efficiency of someone for whom this particular procedure existed in muscle memory. The angle, the location, the controlled pressure of entry, the immediate audible release of trapped air, the correction in the soldier's chest mechanics that was visible within seconds. His breathing changed, not fixed, not solved, but the immediate crisis suspended, the ticking clock reset to a longer interval. Reyes exhaled in a way that was more than just air. Good. She stood. Bay 3, chest tube to follow. Marcus, you're doing the tube. I've done 2 chest tubes, Marcus said, from somewhere to her right. Now you've done 3. Darius is with you. Go. She moved to the next incoming. Well, somewhere in the 40 minutes that followed, Malcolm Strick stopped trying to interrupt her. She didn't notice the exact moment it happened. She was too busy to track it, too busy cataloging injuries and triaging decisions and keeping the floor from collapsing into the particular chaos that happens when a system gets more input than it was built to handle. But at some point, the voice behind her went quiet, and the security guards who had been hovering in the corridor peripheral vision drifted to the edges of the room, and the floor became something she was navigating rather than fighting. The staff adapted. That was the other thing she hadn't expected, or hadn't let herself expect. How quickly they moved from who is this woman to what does she need. Sandra had been the first, but she wasn't the only one. Darius had synced within the first 10 minutes, operating on her verbal shorthand without needing things repeated. An older nurse named Beverly, who had the quiet authority of someone who'd been on this floor since before the building was renovated, fell into step with a competence that Nora recognized. A version of her own approach, actually. Someone who'd been doing this long enough that the ego had mostly burned away, and what was left was just the work. The count settled at 11. 11 casualties from the Route 9 incident, ranging from the young soldier with the pneumothorax to 2 civilians with minor lacerations who technically could have walked in under their own power. Of the 11, 3 were critical, 5 were serious but stable, 3 were walking wounded in the truest sense. Nobody died in the ambulance bay. Nobody died in triage. The soldier she'd carried in, the first one, the reason she'd come to this building at all, was in surgery by 9:30. The notes Marcus had written on the chart, she noticed later, included a section labeled Field Assessment by Responding Medical Personnel that was more detailed and accurate than anything she'd have written herself if she'd had time to write it. She was standing at the edge of the corridor near Bay 1, watching through the window as the post-surgical team managed the transition, when she heard footsteps behind her that had a different quality than the rest. Military boots on linoleum have a specific sound, distinct from soft-soled nursing shoes and dress shoes and the various sneakers and clogs that populate a hospital floor. She'd learned to hear the difference a long time ago. She turned around. The man who walked into Cascade Valley Medical Center at 10:12 p.m. was not in a combat uniform. He was in dress greens, which meant he'd been somewhere official before Route 9 pulled him here, and his rank insignia marked him as a lieutenant colonel, late 40s, compact, the kind of posture that doesn't loosen with age because it was trained in young enough. He had the eyes of someone running multiple tracks simultaneously, taking in the floor, the staff, the patients, the ambient situation, and filing it all away in the space of a single sweep. He saw her. He stopped. Not in surprise, exactly. In the specific way people stop when they find something they were looking for in a place they hadn't expected to find it. "Vasquez," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "Hargrove," she said. Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Hargrove had been her commanding officer for 18 months, in circumstances that neither of them would be discussing in this corridor. He'd processed her separation papers himself, which had been either a kindness or a formality. She'd never decided which. "You want to tell me what happened on Route 9?" she said. "Not out here." He glanced around the floor. Not paranoid, just precise. "Where can we talk?" "I'm a little occupied right now." "I can see that." He looked at the bay windows, did a fast sweep of the casualties. "The situation is contained?" "Medically, yes. For the next 20 minutes. After that, I can't promise anything." 20 minutes is enough." He looked at her. "You look like you drove through the mountain." "I drove through the rain." "Same thing in October." He almost said something else. Stopped himself. "You saved some of my people tonight. Someone compromised your convoy route. You should work on that." A slight tightening around his eyes. "Yes, we should." She looked at him for another second. He wasn't giving her more than that, not in a hallway, not with staff in earshot, and she'd worked with him long enough to know that when Hargrove went controlled and spare, it meant the situation was bigger than the visible surface. She filed that away. 20 minutes, she said, and went back to work. What she missed in those 20 minutes was the conversation between Hargrove and Strick. She pieced it together later from fragments, from what Sandra told her afterward, from what she could read in the changed quality of Strick's behavior when she came back down the corridor, from the specific way Calloway had gone quiet and was standing slightly apart from his colleague with the body language of someone who has just mentally resigned from a sinking ship. Hargrove had not raised his voice. People who had been in earshot of it were consistent on that point. He'd spoken at a normal volume, in the clipped and specific way of a man who has given many briefings to people who needed information organized and delivered without decoration. He'd explained who Nora Vasquez was in terms that he was permitted to explain. He had not explained everything, because some of it was sealed, but what he explained was apparently sufficient. What she gathered was that by the time she came back down the corridor, Malcolm Strick knew 3 things he hadn't known at 9 o'clock. That the woman he'd tried to have removed from his hospital had a military background he wasn't cleared to know the details of. That her field stabilization had likely saved at minimum 2 of the 11 casualties from outcomes that would have generated the kind of federal investigation that would have involved his hospital, and that the lieutenant colonel standing in his corridor was not someone whose calls went to voicemail. Strick didn't apologize. She didn't expect him to. Men like Strick didn't apologize. They recalibrated, which involved a kind of performed neutrality that was more exhausting to be around than open hostility, because at least open hostility was honest. He was neutrally, professionally, emphatically present when she came back down the corridor, and he said nothing about unauthorized practice or restricted areas or the security office or any of the other things he'd been saying 2 hours earlier. She barely registered the change. She was too tired and too focused on the floor. Hargrove fell into step beside her. "Tell me what you saw on Route 9, he said. "You tell me what I was seeing on Route 9. The rockfall was engineered. She'd known that. She'd known it from the geometry of it, the pattern of debris, the way the rocks had come down across the road in a spread that wasn't consistent with natural collapse. She'd known it and filed it and kept moving because moving was the job. "Who?" she said. "That's what we're determining." "Hargrove." "Nora." She stopped walking. He stopped too. "I was 6 hours from Harlow when I pulled off for gas. I ended up in a roadside ditch in the dark pulling shrapnel out of someone's leg because I happened to hear a pressure signature I shouldn't have been able to identify unless I'd been trained to identify it. And then I ended up in this hospital defending myself to a man in a suit while soldiers I stabilized came through the door behind me." She looked at him. "So I'm going to ask you once more, and I'd appreciate an actual answer. What was on that convoy?" Hargrove looked at her for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not reluctance exactly. More like the process of deciding how much of a locked room to open. "Medical equipment," he said. "And documentation." "What kind of documentation?" "The kind that doesn't travel by email." She let the silence sit for a moment. "Someone knew the route," she said. "Yes. And the documentation, is it still on the convoy?" "That's what my team is determining right now." A pause. "The third vehicle took the least damage. The equipment bays may be intact." "Maybe. We won't know until the scene is secured." She started walking again. He kept pace. "You should have a forensics team on that ridge within the hour," she said. "Whoever set the rockfall had to access it from the north. There's no southern approach that gets you to that rock face without going through private land. The approach trail will have sign." Hargrove looked at her sideways. "You assessed the ridge in the dark, in the rain, while carrying a casualty." "I was carrying him, not wearing a blindfold." A pause. "It's good to see you, Vasquez." "Don't. I'm serious." "I know. Don't." They walked the rest of the corridor in silence. Checked. The floor stabilized around 11. Not fully. 3 patients still needed active monitoring, 2 more were being held for observation, and the surgical suite was occupied until past midnight. But the acute crisis phase was over in the way that acute phases end. Not with resolution, but with exhaustion. With the particular quiet that follows maximum noise, when the adrenaline has metabolized, and what's left is the slow work. Nora sat down for the first time since she'd entered the building. The break room was small and smelled like burnt coffee, and the particular industrial cleaner that all hospital break rooms smell like everywhere in the world, as if there were a single contract manufacturer for that smell, supplying every medical facility on the continent. She didn't make new coffee. She sat at the table and put both hands flat on the surface and looked at them for a moment. They were steady. They'd been steady all night. They were usually steady when she was working and less steady when she stopped, which was one of the things she'd stopped trying to analyze and started just living with. Ranger put his head on her knee. She put a hand on his head. Beverly came in after a few minutes, poured 2 cups of the burnt coffee without asking, set one in front of Nora, and sat down across from her. She didn't say anything immediately, which Nora appreciated. There was a particular kind of person who needed to fill silence with acknowledgement, with processing, with that was intense, and are you okay, and the verbal architecture of shared experience. And Beverly was not that kind of person. She just sat there and drank bad coffee, and for a couple of minutes the break room was just 2 people and a dog, and the sound of the building settling. "Darius wants to know where you trained," Beverly said finally. "Tell him somewhere cold." Beverly made a sound that was almost a laugh. He's going to keep asking. I know. Another silence. That second soldier, Beverly said. Bay 2, the TBI. He's stabilized. Nora nodded. Marcus called 3 different hospitals before he got a neurologist on the phone. Followed your instructions the whole time. A pause. Kid's got some backbone, it turns out. He was doing fine. He was terrified. Same thing sometimes. Beverly looked at her over the rim of the cup with the expression of a woman who was recalibrating something. Not performing it, actually doing it, genuinely revising whatever her initial assessment had been. Nora had seen that look on Beverly's face earlier in the night, actually, the first time she'd given a call that Beverly had clearly thought was going to be wrong, and then watched turn out to be right. It was the look of someone who had been in their own field long enough to recognize competence in its various forms, even the ones that didn't come with the expected packaging. You're not going to tell me anything about yourself, are you? Beverly said. It wasn't really a question. Probably not tonight. Beverly stood, rinsed her cup, set it on the rack. For what it's worth, she stopped with her hand on the door. What you did tonight. People in this building are going to be thinking about it for a while. She left before Nora had to respond. Tuan. Hargrove found her in the break room 20 minutes later. He sat down across from her in the chair Beverly had vacated, leaned forward with his elbows on the table, and looked at her with the expression she remembered, the one that meant he was about to tell her something she wasn't going to like. The documentation is gone, he said. She absorbed that. Taken from the vehicle? The equipment bay in Vehicle 3 was empty when the scene team arrived. The convoy wasn't carrying pharmaceutical equipment as listed, or rather it was, but that was the secondary cargo. The primary cargo was a series of encrypted drives and physical documentation related to an internal investigation. Investigation into what? He measured something behind his eyes. A procurement irregularity, that's the official language. And the unofficial language? Someone has been redirecting military medical supply contracts for approximately 2 years. Not small redirections. The documentation on those drives represented 14 months of compiled evidence. The break room was very quiet. And now it's gone, she said. Now it's gone. So the convoy route was compromised by someone who knew what the convoy was carrying. Yes. Which means the compromise came from inside. Hargrove didn't answer immediately. That was its own answer. Nora sat with that for a moment. The tiredness she'd been holding at the edges of her body started pressing in more aggressively, and she pushed back against it with the particular stubbornness of someone who has learned that tiredness is not a valid reason to stop thinking. How many people knew the convoy contents? She said. That's the current question. Current answer? 17 people had official access to the manifest. The route was filed through a logistics channel with 4 authorized viewers. He paused. The overlap is 2. 2 people who knew both the contents and the route. Yes. And one of them isn't you. He looked at her. You wouldn't be sitting here telling me this if you were the leak, she said. You'd be somewhere else making sure this conversation never happened. There are people who would appreciate your confidence. I'm not confident. I'm logical. She looked at him. So 2 people. One of them is in a position where losing that documentation is a disaster, and the convoy attack happened fast enough that it had to be pre-planned, not improvised when the route was filed, which means whoever arranged this has been watching the investigation timeline and had a trigger ready. Hargrove said nothing. The drives, she said. Are they physically destroyed or just missing? Unknown. The vehicle bay showed no explosive damage. The lock was cut. So someone was on that ridge waiting specifically to retrieve, not to destroy. They wanted the documentation intact. That's the working theory. That's not a theory. That's the only explanation that fits the method. She stood up. Ranger stood with her. Someone cut that lock in the dark, in the rain, in the middle of managing a rockfall they'd just triggered, and they got out before your scene team arrived. That's not improvised. That's practiced. Hargrove was watching her with the look she'd seen before, the one that she'd always had trouble naming, something between professional respect and something more complicated that she'd never given him an opening to clarify. What are you suggesting? He said. I'm not suggesting anything. You're the one with the investigation. I'm a civilian sitting in a break room. A civilian who just managed a mass casualty event in a hospital where I don't have privileges. Yes, she picked up Ranger's lead, which I'm going to need to be somewhere else by morning before someone decides to make that into a legal problem. Strick isn't going to... You don't know what Strick is going to do. You had a conversation with him that changed his behavior for the last 2 hours. That's not the same as changing his agenda. She looked at Hargrove levelly. He was on his phone when I walked into this hospital. He was on his phone when casualties came through the door. He's been on his phone in this building more than he's been doing anything else. The silence in the break room changed quality. Hargrove went very still in the way that people go still when something they've been thinking about abstractly suddenly sharpens into a specific shape. He's an administrator, he said. He is, Nora said. What hospital administrators are on their phone during a mass casualty event isn't a question I can answer for you, but it's probably a question worth asking. She moved to the door. Vasquez. She stopped. The two people who had access to both the manifest and the route, Hargrove said. He stopped. Yeah? One of them is military. One of them is a civilian contractor. She turned to look at him. The contractor, he said carefully. Their firm has a service contract with 3 regional medical facilities in this state. The break room felt smaller. Including this one, she said. It wasn't a question. She could read it in the pause before he answered, in the specific quality of the silence he let exist between the statement and his response. Including this one, he said. Ranger pressed against her leg. Outside the break room, through the walls, she could hear the floor, the monitors, the movement, the persistent mechanical sounds of a building keeping people alive. She could hear the distance between what she'd known an hour ago and what she knew now, and it was a much larger distance than she'd expected. She stood in the doorway of the break room and looked back at Hargrove. Where's Strick right now? Hargrove checked his watch. Last I saw, the administrative wing, East Corridor. She was already moving. The administrative wing at this hour was empty except for the light under one door at the end of the East Corridor. Calloway's office, as it turned out. Though the name on the door didn't change the fact that Strick was inside it, which she could confirm from the voice she could hear through the door as she approached. He wasn't shouting. He was speaking in the compressed, fast tone of someone who needed the call to be over but couldn't end it yet, and there were specific words in what she could hear, contained, already handled, the drives aren't, that she registered and kept moving past, because stopping in a hallway to eavesdrop was not the same as having something she could use. She needed something she could use. She walked past Calloway's office and kept going to the end of the corridor where the administrative records room was locked with a keypad. She stood in front of it for a moment. Ranger looked up at her. I know, she said. She was a civilian with no credentials in a hospital where she'd already spent the better part of 3 hours in a legal gray area. She was tired in the bone-deep way that comes after high-output focus, and she was working on inference rather than evidence. And the most sensible thing she could do right now was walk back down the corridor and find Hargrove and let the people with actual authority handle the part that required authority. She was good at sensible. She was better at the other thing. She took out her phone and sent Hargrove a text. East Corridor. Strick is on a call. I need 5 minutes and someone with a key card. 30 seconds later, her phone buzzed. Stay where you are. She stayed where she was. Ranger sat down. His ears moved slightly, tracking sounds through the walls with the particular focus of an animal who had been trained to pay attention to things that humans couldn't quite locate. He looked at the door to the left of the records room. Not Calloway's office, the other door. A service door, half-paneled in frosted glass, that connected the administrative wing to the building's service corridor. The kind of door that maintenance used. The kind of door that wouldn't appear on a standard floor plan unless you were looking for it. Ranger looked at that door the way he looked at things when he'd found something. The door was slightly open. Not open as in unlocked. Open as in ajar. A 2-inch gap, barely visible in the corridor light. The seal broken in a way that could have been maintenance, and wasn't, because maintenance didn't leave doors ajar at this hour without a reason, and the building's maintenance staff had been accounted for in the initial crisis response. She put her hand flat against the door. Ranger was up, weight forward, completely silent. She pushed the door open. The service corridor was narrow and dark and smelled like the other side of a hospital. Pipes and cabling and the less curated version of the clean public spaces. Emergency lighting threw everything in low amber, enough to see the length of it, enough to see the exit sign at the far end, enough to see the person moving quickly away from her toward that exit with something carried under one arm and a bag over the other shoulder, and the particular fast walk of someone who is trying not to run. She wasn't close enough to see a face. She was close enough to see what was in the hand that wasn't carrying the bag. A small, hard-sided case, black, the kind used for encrypted hardware transport, the kind used for drives. She said, "Stop." The person didn't stop. They accelerated toward the exit. Ranger went from sitting to full pursuit speed in one movement, and the service corridor was suddenly not a corridor at all, but a very short distance between a dog who had been trained for exactly this and a person who was about to find out what that meant. The exit door burst open. Rain and cold air flooded in from outside. And somewhere behind her, from the direction of the main corridor, she heard the sound of military boots. More than one set, moving fast. And Hargrove's voice, carrying without shouting in the particular way of someone who has given orders in loud environments and knows exactly how to make the words cut through. She was already running. The cold hit her like a wall when she cleared the door, the rain immediate and total, and she came out into the hospital's rear service yard. Asphalt, dumpsters, loading dock, a chain-link fence at the far edge with a gap in it that the running figure was heading for. Ranger was faster. He was always faster. That was the point of Ranger. She watched him cut the angle, watched the exact moment when the running figure heard him and turned and made the decision that you should not make when a Belgian Malinois is 12 feet away from you and closing, the decision to keep running. The tackle was controlled. That was the word for it in the training manuals. Controlled apprehension. What it looked like in practice was a dog hitting a person at speed and bringing them down in a way that prioritized containment over comfort, and then holding there with 90 pounds of weight and locked jaw on a sleeve that was not going anywhere until Nora arrived. She arrived. The figure on the ground was face down, one arm held by Ranger, one hand still loosely gripping the black case. Nora put her knee in the center of the person's back and put her hand on the case. The figure turned their head. It wasn't Strick. It was the woman with the tablet. The one who'd been in the security office taking notes during Strick's interrogation of Nora. Mid-30s, dark hair, the contractor lanyard that she'd been wearing all night. Nora had noticed her the way she noticed most things, cataloged, filed, not yet significant. The woman looked up at her from the wet asphalt with rain running down her face, and the specific expression of someone who has been caught and has not yet decided whether to talk. Nora took the black case. "Ranger, release." He released. She stood up, case in hand, rain soaking through her already soaked scrubs, and looked down at the woman on the ground while the sound of running boots got louder behind her. The woman said nothing, just looked up at her with those calculating eyes, the rain hitting her face, processing what had just happened and what it meant and how bad it was going to be. Nora looked at the case in her hand. Somewhere behind her, she heard Hargrove's voice giving instructions to the soldiers who'd come through the service door. Somewhere inside the building, she was fairly certain Malcolm Strick had just ended his phone call and was about to find out that the woman he'd tried to have escorted from his building was standing in his service yard holding the thing that was going to unravel everything. She looked at the case. She looked at the contractor on the ground. And she thought about the specific phrasing Hargrove had used. A civilian contractor, he'd said. Their firm has a service contract with 3 regional medical facilities. 3. Not 1. 3. Which meant whatever was on these drives, whatever Malcolm Strick had been calling about for 2 hours in the middle of a mass-casualty event, was not a local problem. She opened the case. The drives were there, 4 of them, stacked in foam cutouts, undamaged. But underneath the drives, visible in the gap between the foam layer and the case wall, was a folded document, not digital, physical. The kind of thing you keep on paper specifically because paper doesn't leave a server trail. She pulled it out, unfolded it in the rain. The first line was a list of facility names. Cascade Valley Medical Center was 3rd on the list. The second line was a dollar amount that she read twice because the first time she read it, she thought she'd misplaced a comma. She had not misplaced a comma. Hargrove appeared at her shoulder and looked at the document. She felt him go still in the way he'd gone still in the break room. That particular quality of a man absorbing information that has just expanded the scale of what he thought he was dealing with. Behind them, the soldiers had the contractor on her feet. The rain kept falling. And inside the hospital, visible through the service door that was still swinging on its hinges, the corridor light showed a figure standing at the junction of the east hallway. Malcolm Strick, phone in his hand, staring out at the service yard with an expression that had completed its journey from authority through neutrality and arrived somewhere that looked very much like the beginning of understanding how badly the night had gone wrong for him. He saw Nora holding the case. He saw the document in her hand. He saw Hargrove. He took one step back. And the door at the other end of the east corridor, the main entrance from the lobby, opened, and two men in civilian clothes with federal identification walked through it, and Malcolm Strick stood between them and the service yard with nowhere left to go and the particular stillness of a man who has just run out of calls to make. The two federal agents moved like men who had done this before. Not fast, not aggressive, but with the specific economy of people who understood that the outcome was already determined and the only variable was how long Strick was going to make it take. He didn't run. She'd half expected him to, in the way that cornered people sometimes make irrational calculations in the last second before options close. But he didn't. He stood at the junction of the east corridor with his phone in his hand and his shoulders doing something complicated, dropping, maybe, or just losing the structure that had been holding them up all night. And he watched the two men walk toward him with the expression of someone who has spent weeks preparing for a meeting and is only now realizing they prepared for the wrong one. Nora came in from the service entrance with the case and the document, and Hargrove a step behind her. Ranger was at her left, rain still beating on his coat. The federal agents, she'd identify them later as Inspectors Marlowe and Seung from the Defense Criminal Investigative Service, didn't acknowledge her immediately. They acknowledged Hargrove, the quick nod of people who'd spoken earlier and were now executing something already arranged, and then they turned to Strick. Mr. Strick. Marlowe, the taller of the two, had a voice calibrated for corridors like this one. Level, public, impossible to misinterpret. We'd like you to come with us. I want my attorney, Strick said. That's your right. You can make that call from the field office. I haven't been charged with anything. No, sir. This is a voluntary interview request. Strick looked at the case in Nora's hands. The document. His eyes stayed on the document for 2 full seconds longer than was useful to him. That's hospital property, he said. Nora looked at him. She didn't say anything. Hargrove said, That's federal evidence. Something moved through Strick's face. Not quite defeat, not yet, but the precursor to it. The moment when a person recognizes that the architecture they built around themselves has started to fail at the load-bearing points. He went with Marlowe and Seung without being asked again. They walked past her in the corridor. Strick looked straight ahead. She watched him go. The contractor's name was Petra Cole. That was what the lanyard said, and it was what she gave to the second pair of investigators who arrived 20 minutes later. And it was, as it turned out, one of the few accurate things she offered voluntarily in the first 6 hours of questioning. She'd been with the firm for 3 years. The firm, Hargrove told Nora in the corridor outside the administrative wing while Seung photographed the document under portable lights, was called Meridian Logistics Solutions, which was the kind of name that communicated nothing specifically and therefore communicated everything about what it was trying to hide. Meridian held service contracts at 11 medical facilities in 3 states. The document in the case was a payment ledger, handwritten, which was either old-fashioned or deliberately evasion-proof depending on how you thought about it. 41 line items over 26 months. The facilities were coded, not named, but the coding pattern was simple enough that Hargrove's team cracked it in the parking lot using the facility identifiers from the convoy manifest. Cascade Valley was line item 7. The amount next to it had 7 figures. For what? Nora said. Supply contracts. On paper, routine consumables, IV materials, disposables, surgical supplies. In practice, Hargrove stopped, looked at her. The supplies were being invoiced at 4 to 6 times market rate. The overcharge went into a holding structure. From there it moved. To who? We're working that. Is Strick the top or the middle? A pause. We don't think he's the top. She absorbed that. The rain had eased to a thin drizzle, and the service yard had filled with people in the last 30 minutes. Investigators, additional military personnel, 2 vehicles with federal plates that had come from somewhere down the valley. The quiet hospital service yard had become a scene, and she was standing in the middle of it in wet scrubs with a dog and no jacket, running on 4 hours of sleep from last night and no sleep tonight. And somewhere behind her, the hospital was still running because hospitals didn't stop. The drives, she said. If Cole got out with them, she didn't. Hargrove, she was heading for that fence. If Ranger hadn't, I know. Something in his voice. I know. She looked at him. The Ridge team found footprints, he said. 2 sets, Cole and 1 other. The second set goes to a vehicle position on the north access road. The vehicle is gone. She was quiet for a moment. So there's another one. Yes. And they don't have the drives because Cole didn't make the fence. Correct. But they don't know Cole didn't make the fence. Hargrove was already looking at her. No, they don't. The drizzle fell between them. Which means, she said slowly, whoever is waiting for those drives is waiting on a call that hasn't come. And the longer it doesn't come, the more they move. Or the more they disappear. People with 7-figure ledger entries don't disappear. They have too much infrastructure. They have supply chains and contacts and institutional cover, and all of it generates friction. You can't dissolve it fast enough once something starts pulling the thread. She looked at the case in her hand. This is the thread. Hargrove took the case from her carefully. Yes. Inside the hospital, the floor had achieved the post-crisis version of itself. Slower, lower volume, the particular exhausted professionalism of a staff that had managed something difficult and was now managing the aftermath of managing it. Marcus was writing notes at the station with the slightly unsteady handwriting of someone who was functional but past the edge of their reserves. Beverly was on the floor checking the patients in sequence with the methodical quiet of someone in their 14th hour who still had 2 to go. The soldier Nora had carried in, she'd learned his name by now, from the chart, from what Beverly had told her. Corporal Damon Reese, 24 years old, 2nd deployment, was out of surgery and in recovery. The notes from the surgical team said the field tourniquet application had prevented blood loss that would have been incompatible with survival given the transport time. She stood outside recovery for a moment. She didn't go in. He didn't know her. He was unconscious and would be for hours, and going in to look at him would have been for her benefit rather than his, and she'd learned a long time ago to tell the difference. She turned around. Marcus was standing at the end of the hallway watching her with the expression of someone who had been trying to decide whether to say something for the past 10 minutes. The pneumothorax, he said. Reyes. He's asking about the dog. Something moved through her chest, not sentimentality. She didn't have a clean relationship with sentimentality, just the particular weight of a person who exists in a moment and recognizes it. Tell him the dog is fine, she said. Marcus nodded. Then, how did you know? About the tension pneumo. He presented with, his trachea was starting to shift, subtle, but it was there. I looked at him in the bay. I didn't. You would have caught it on the next set of vitals. She paused. Maybe. Marcus looked at her. That's not comforting. It's not supposed to be. It's just true. She met his eyes. You did fine tonight. Better than fine. Don't let the gap between what you knew and what you needed to know become the whole story. That gap exists for everyone. What matters is you kept swimming. He was quiet for a moment. Where did you train? Somewhere cold, she said, which was what she'd told Beverly, which was what she told everyone, and it had the advantage of being true. She went back toward the administrative wing. Seung found her in the break room at 1:15 a.m., which was where she'd been for 20 minutes because her legs had finally sent a message she couldn't ignore. He was younger than she'd initially assessed, late 30s, with the particular underfed alertness of an investigator who'd been running on poor sleep and colder coffee than this for longer than was advisable. He sat down without asking. We need a formal statement, he said, about what you observed on Route 9 and in this building. I know. Tonight, if possible. Before details, I know how statements work. He looked at her. You want to know something about that ledger? She waited. Line item 7, Cascade Valley, goes back 18 months. The procurement contact on this end wasn't Strick. He paused. Strick came in 6 months ago. He replaced someone. Who? A man named Calloway. The break room was very quiet. She thought about Calloway standing apart from Strick earlier, the body language of someone mentally stepping away from a sinking ship. She thought about him standing in the service yard looking at the investigators. She thought about the specific choice of his office. Strick had been in Calloway's office, using Calloway's space, with Calloway present. She'd read that as a power dynamic, Strick running the room. But it worked the other way too. Calloway providing cover, Calloway keeping Strick where he could manage him. Calloway's been in this building the whole night, she said. Yes. Where is he now? Seong's expression changed in a specific way. The controlled shift of someone delivering information they'd been holding until the right moment. That's the current problem, he said. He showed her his phone, the lobby camera feed. The timestamp said 12:58 a.m. The frame showed the main entrance, the automatic doors, the wet darkness beyond, a figure in a coat moving through them. The resolution was good enough to confirm the lanyard, the posture, the specific way Calloway moved, which she'd observed all night, going out, not being escorted out, not with investigators, alone. 12 minutes ago. She was on her feet before Seong finished the sentence he hadn't started yet, and Ranger was up with her, and the break room fell behind them as she moved back into the corridor with the specific focused energy of someone who has been still for 20 minutes and is now, again, the only thing in the room that knows what comes next. The lobby was 40 feet ahead, and the automatic doors were still swinging. The lobby was empty except for the night security guard, Pete, who had apparently been reassigned to the front entrance after his earlier reluctance in the corridor, and who looked up from his station when Nora came through at something close to a run. The man who just left, she said. Which direction? Pete pointed left without hesitating. Parking structure. He had his keys out. She went through the doors. The drizzle had thinned to something between mist and rain, the kind of precipitation that doesn't feel like weather, so much as the air being wet, and the hospital's exterior lighting cast everything in the amber gray of institutional nighttime. The parking structure entrance was 60 feet to the left, open air on the ground level, a ramp going up to 2 covered decks. She heard the engine before she reached the entrance, the particular sound of a car in a concrete structure, the acoustics multiplying it, bouncing it off pillars and low ceilings. Ranger pulled slightly ahead of her. She let him. They came through the entrance in time to see taillights, a dark sedan, backing fast out of a space on the near side of the ground level. The reverse lights lit the concrete in white, and then the car swung hard and the tires found traction and it accelerated toward the exit ramp. Seong was behind her, breathing hard. He had his radio up. Vehicle leaving parking structure, Cascade Valley, dark sedan, partial plate. He was reading it off as the car went past, and she heard him get 4 characters before the angle closed and the plate disappeared around the ramp curve. The sedan hit the exit, hesitated at the barrier arm. Nora watched it, measuring the decision, and then went through the barrier arm rather than waiting for it, the arm snapping off and skittering across the wet asphalt, and the car turned north and its taillights shrank into the dark. North. Route 9 was north. She stood at the parking structure exit and watched the lights disappear, and felt the specific frustration of a situation that has been almost contained and has just opened a new edge. The evidence was secured. Strick was in federal custody. Cole was in federal custody. The drives were with Hargrove's team. By any reasonable accounting, what she'd come here to do, which was nothing, which was get gas and keep driving, was done. But Calloway was running north toward a road where 12 people had been hurt tonight, toward a ridge where someone had waited in the rain with a cutting tool in a vehicle, and the person in that second set of footprints hadn't been found yet. She went back inside. Hargrove was in the administrative wing coordinating with Marlowe when she found him, and she told him about the car in 12 words, and he was on his radio before she finished. The Montana State Police had a unit on Route 9 already. The accident scene was still being processed. and the description of the sedan went out on the channel in under 90 seconds. Then she sat down. Not because she wanted to, because Hargrove put a hand on her shoulder and said, "You've done enough tonight," in the tone of a man who doesn't say things like that lightly, and because she was honest enough with herself to know that her body had been sending signals for the past hour that she'd been overriding through stubbornness, and that stubbornness had a finite account. She sat in a chair in the administrative wing corridor, and Ranger put his head on her knee, and she stayed there while the building moved around her. Investigators coming and going, the night staff doing their quiet rotations, the mechanical rhythm of a hospital that doesn't have an off switch. Seung came back 20 minutes later with a legal pad and a pen, and she gave him her statement. All of it. Route 9, the ditch, the stabilization, the carry, the hospital, the service yard, the case, the document. She spoke in the precise sequence of someone who has organized information professionally, and Seong wrote and asked 3 clarifying questions in 45 minutes, and stopped asking when she stopped talking. "You're going to need to be available for follow-up," he said. "I'm not leaving Harlow until you say otherwise." "I appreciate that." He capped the pen, looked at her. "The people on that convoy, the critical Reese, he's going to make it." She already knew that from the post-surgical notes, but she nodded. "The field tourniquet," Seung said. He looked briefly like he was going to say something more, and then changed his mind, which she appreciated, because she didn't need the rest of the sentence. Morning came the way mornings come after nights like that. Not cleanly, not with the light changing and the birds and the sense of reset that morning is supposed to provide. It came grudgingly, gray seeping into the windows of the break room where she'd eventually ended up, sitting across from a cup of coffee she'd made herself because Beverly had gone off shift at 2 a.m. and the burn pot had been sitting empty. The coffee she made was not as bad as the pot that had been sitting. It was not good. She drank it anyway. The floor was on the day shift by 7, which meant new faces, which meant the story of the previous night had to be filtered through the layers of institutional communication that hospitals use. Incident reports, verbal handoffs, the particular hallway whisper network that exists in every building where people work in proximity under pressure. She was aware of being looked at. Not openly. The sideways quality of a floor that knows something happened and is still assembling the official version. She'd been on floors like this before, in different buildings with different floors, and she'd learned that the best response to being looked at was to give people nothing to look at, which meant moving purposefully and not performing anything. She was checking on Reyes, the 19-year-old with the pneumothorax, when the first day shift nurse stopped her. His name tag said Torres, and he had the particular energy of someone who had come into a shift briefing that was considerably more detailed than usual and was still processing. "You're Vasquez," he said. "Yes." "You're the one who—" He stopped. The chest decompression on Reyes. "Marcus and Darius did the tube." "But you called it." She looked at him. He wasn't accusatory. He was something else. The specific expression of someone who trained for emergencies and simulation and was recalibrating their understanding of the gap between simulation and the thing itself. "How's he doing?" she said. Torres blinked, refocused. "Good. Really good, actually. Chest tubes draining well, respiratory rate normalized around 4 a.m. He's been awake and talking since 6. "Good." She moved past him. Reyes was in a room at the end of the East Patient Wing, which she found was the opposite end of the building from the Administrative Wing, which struck her as the correct design philosophy. He was awake when she pushed the door open, sitting up at about 30 degrees, chest tube still in place, the particular pale that comes after a night of medical intervention and the first morning of being alive in a way you weren't certain about the night before. He looked at her, then at the door, then back at her. "Is that the dog?" he said. Ranger was at the threshold. "Yes." "They told me a dog." He stopped. His voice had the hoarse quality of someone who'd been intubated and recently extubated, every word costing a little more than it should. "He brought you down the corridor." "He was with me, yes." Reyes looked at Ranger with the unfocused intensity of someone still metabolizing pain medication. "What's his name?" "Ranger." "Ranger." He seemed to try the word out, nodded slightly, which clearly cost him. "Okay, That's a pause. I heard you in the bay when I was going under. You said 30 seconds and you said I was going to be fine. Yes. Was that true when you said it? She looked at him. He was 19 and he'd been intubated in an emergency procedure performed by a man who'd done it twice before, in a hospital where he wasn't supposed to be, after a roadside attack that wasn't supposed to happen. The honest answer was that she'd said it because people who believe they're going to be fine make physiological choices that improve their odds of being fine, and that her assessment at the time was that his odds were better than 50-50 if the next 90 seconds went correctly. Close enough, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Thank you, he said. The two words had the weight of someone who had been thinking about them for hours and had decided they were insufficient and was using them anyway because they were what he had. She nodded, stepped back from the door. She didn't trust herself with more than that. Hargrove found her in the parking lot at 9:15. The morning had come all the way in by then. Still gray, still cold, the mountains visible in the north with snow on the upper ridges and the lower slopes dark with pine. Harlow looked different in daylight, more solid than it had seemed arriving in the rain the previous night, a real town rather than a collection of lights and wet asphalt. She'd been standing beside her truck for 10 minutes, not getting in it, not entirely sure what she was doing. Calloway didn't make it far, Hargrove said. She turned. He had 2 cups of coffee from somewhere, a gas station, from the look of the cups, which meant he'd been out and come back, which meant he'd been awake since at least the previous afternoon and was still running on the compressed efficiency of someone who has decided sleep is a later problem. He gave her one of the cups. State police picked him up on Route 9 at the 3-mile marker, he said. He'd pulled over. His phone was dead and the car had maybe 12 miles of range left on the tank. A pause. He wasn't trying to disappear. He was trying to make a call. To who? That's the question of the morning. Hargrove looked north toward the ridge. The second set of footprints from the scene, the one with the vehicle, we have a partial tire impression. Cross-referenced with commercial registrations in a 3-county radius, we're down to 4 candidates. That's a short list. Short enough. She drank the gas station coffee, which was worse than the pot she'd made in the break room. She drank it anyway. Calloway talked, she said. Hargrove's expression shifted in a way that wasn't quite an answer. He's talking, he said. The distinction between talking and saying something useful is... He paused. He's been managing this for 18 months. He has a particular talent for presenting cooperation while providing information that's selectively incomplete. What did he give you? He confirmed the Meridian arrangement, confirmed the payment structure, gave us 2 names at the firm level we didn't have. He looked at her. He's positioning himself as a mid-level participant who is under pressure rather than a primary architect. Is that true? It's partially true, which is the most dangerous kind of story. It has enough truth in it to be credible. He drank from his own cup. The primary architect is someone Calloway refers to as a logistics coordinator. No name. He claims he communicated only through Meridian's internal system and doesn't have direct contact information. And Cole? Cole is the logistics coordinator's liaison. She's the one who moved between the facilities. She's also, we discovered this morning, not actually named Petra Cole. Nora looked at him. The identity is fabricated, he said. The lanyard, the employment record, the contractor license, all assembled. She was placed here 6 months ago when Calloway's role was being wound down and Strick was brought in. Strick didn't know? Strick knew he was being brought into an existing arrangement and that there were conditions to his employment he wasn't meant to examine closely. He either didn't know or didn't ask the right questions. Hargrove paused. His attorney is arguing the latter. She was quiet for a moment. The mountain stood there in the north, indifferent to what had happened at its base. The drives, she said. Have your analysts started on them? Since 4 a.m., the data is intact. 41 facilities across 3 states, 26 months of transactions. The scope is... He stopped. Larger than the ledger suggested. Considerably. She looked at the truck. At Ranger, who was watching her from behind the glass with his ears up and his head slightly tilted, the perpetual assessment of a dog who has decided his job is to know what she's going to do before she does it. What do you need from me? She said. Today? Your formal recorded statement, which Seong will do properly with a camera. Availability for follow-up as the investigation develops. He paused. And something else. She waited. The woman in the service yard, not Cole. He said it carefully. She asked about you this morning, during the initial interview. She asked who you were and what your connection to the military investigation was. And Seong told her you were a civilian who happened to be on the road when the convoy was attacked. A pause. She didn't believe him. Nora looked at Hargrove. She said, and I'm quoting, that woman knew exactly what she was looking for. The parking lot was quiet except for the wind off the mountain. She's not wrong, Nora said. No, but the reason I'm telling you is that whoever sent her here, whoever she's connected to above Callaway, they're now asking the same question. Who is Nora Vasquez, and why was she at Route 9, and why does she know how to find encrypted drives in a hospital service corridor? She understood what he was telling her. It wasn't just about the investigation moving forward. It was about the investigation having identified her, which meant the other side of the investigation had identified her, which meant the person in the second set of footprints, the one still out there, the one Callaway had been trying to call, had a name to look up now. Her name. How sealed is my file? She said. Hargrove was quiet for a moment in the way that quiet carries its own information. It was sealed when you separated. That's not what I asked. I know. She looked at him directly. He looked back. He was a man who was capable of honesty when honesty cost him something, which was rarer than it should be, and was the reason she'd trusted him when she'd trusted very few people in that period of her life. Someone with the right access and the right motive could reconstruct enough, he said, not the classified details, but the broad shape of your service record, your separation, your location. My location was a gas station on the highway. Your truck is registered, Montana plate. He paused. Current address on the registration is a P.O. box in Billings, which helps. But someone who knows what they're looking for, how long do I have before that becomes a problem? I don't know. Could be days, could be... He stopped himself. I have a team putting a watch on your name in relevant databases. If someone pulls it, we'll know within 24 hours. She nodded. She got in the truck. She sat there for a moment with the engine not running, looking at the hospital through the windshield. At the entrance where she'd walked in with Reese across her shoulders 12 hours ago. At the ambulance bay where 11 casualties had come through. At the east wing where a 19-year-old soldier was breathing steadily because a chest tube had been placed in time. Hargrove was still standing beside the truck. He wasn't finished. There's something else, he said through the window she'd left down. She looked at him. The document you pulled from the case. The payment ledger. He put his hand on the roof of the truck, a gesture that was somehow both casual and weighted. Line item 3 on that ledger. Not Cascade Valley. The third facility. He paused. It's Renner Institute, Billings. She kept her face still. Renner Institute is a military rehabilitation facility, he said. It treats wounded personnel. The supply diversion there has been running the longest, 31 months. The equipment being redirected included prosthetic components, neurological monitoring equipment, rehabilitation devices. She kept her face still. The patients at Renner are people who came back from deployments, he said. They're in recovery. They need that equipment to function. I understand what a rehabilitation facility is, Hargrove. I know you do. He looked at her. I know you do. There was something in those words that they were both aware of, a shape between them that had a name neither of them used. She'd been separated under sealed circumstances. Renner Institute was in Billings. Her P.O. box was in Billings. These facts were not unrelated. She started the truck. I'll be at the Harlow Inn, she said. Room 6. I'll be there for Seong's recorded statement. Vasquez. She looked at him. Are you okay? It was the first time anyone had asked her that since she'd walked through the hospital doors, which was probably appropriate timing. Ask someone if they're okay in the middle of a crisis and you're just adding noise. But ask them in the aftermath when the adrenaline is down and the arithmetic of what happened is starting to settle. That's when the question lands. She thought about the honest answer. The honest answer was complicated and required distinguishing between the physical version of okay and the other versions, and she was okay enough on the physical dimension and less okay on the dimensions that didn't have clean metrics. And she had a P.O. box in Billings that she'd given Hargrove without explanation, and he'd taken without asking, which meant he already knew the explanation. "I'm upright," she said. "That's what I've got right now." He stepped back from the truck. She pulled out of the parking lot. The Harlow Inn was 4 blocks from the hospital, a 2-story building that had the managed decline of a place that had once been the nicest option in town and had been passed by when a chain property opened on the highway. Room 6 had brown carpet and a window that looked onto the alley and a bed with a bedspread in a pattern that had probably been selected in 1987. It was quiet and it was private and it had a bathtub, which was the only criteria she'd been applying when she'd checked in at 7:30. She ran the bath hot and sat on the edge of it for a few minutes, watching the steam rise before she got in, which was a thing she'd been doing since she got back. The sitting before, the hesitation before most normal activities, a half-second gap between intention and action that hadn't been there before. She'd mentioned it once to a counselor at a VA facility who'd given her language for it that she'd immediately disliked because the language made it feel permanent. She preferred to think of it as a calibration delay, the body checking its own systems before committing. She got in the bath. Ranger lay on the bath mat, which he always did when she bathed, which she'd never asked him to do and had never told him to stop. She stayed in the water until it was no longer hot. She thought about Renner Institute. She thought about 31 months of diverted rehabilitation equipment reaching people who needed it to recover from injuries they'd taken in service of something larger than themselves. And what happened to those recoveries when the equipment didn't show up, or showed up inadequate, or showed up as a cheaper substitute that performed at 70% of the specified standard? She knew the answer. She'd watched some of those recoveries. The anger was there. It had been there since she'd seen the ledger in the rain, since she'd read Renner at line item 3, since she'd understood the full shape of what Meridian had been running for 31 months in 11 facilities across 3 states. She'd kept it in its correct compartment through the night, because anger in the wrong compartment makes you slower and less precise, and she'd needed to be faster and more precise than anyone in that building. But now she was in the bath and the crisis phase was genuinely over, and there was no reason to keep it managed. She let it sit in her chest for a while without doing anything with it. That was also something she'd learned, not from a counselor, from herself, from enough time working with it, that there's a difference between feeling a thing and acting on it, and that the decision about what to do with anger has to be made when you're not inside it. You feel it first. Then you decide. She decided. She got out of the bath, dried off, dressed in the cleanest clothes she had in her bag, which was a relative scale, lay down on the bed with the brown carpet and the 1987 bedspread, and was asleep in 4 minutes. Seung knocked at 2 p.m. He came in with a camera, a colleague she hadn't met named Ariaga, who handled the recording equipment, and a folder of documents that he laid on the small table by the window. The recorded statement took 90 minutes. She told it the same way she'd told it the night before, in sequence, in precise language, without editorializing, without filling silences with reassurances. Seung stopped the recording at the end, looked at his notes, and said, "I need to ask you about one more thing." She waited. Calloway's vehicle. When state police stopped him at the 3-mile marker, he had his phone out, dead battery, but he'd been attempting to call a number repeatedly in the 20 minutes between leaving the hospital and being stopped. The phone recovered enough charge during transport for us to pull the recent activity. He slid a piece of paper across the table. The number was a cell number with a Montana area code. She looked at it. Then she looked at Seung. "That number," she said. "Did you run it?" "Yes." "And?" "It's registered to a medical consulting firm based in Billings." He paused. "The firm's primary government contract is with the Rehabilitation Services Division of the Regional VA Network." The room was very quiet. "The VA network that includes Renner Institute," she said. "Yes." She picked up the piece of paper and looked at the number again, looked at the area code, looked at the specific 7 digits that followed. She set it back down. "I've seen this number before," she said. Seung's expression didn't change, But something in the air of the room shifted. Where? She thought about the right answer to that question. The honest answer involved the specifics of her separation, which was sealed, which meant she could be precise about the fact without being precise about the context. She could give him the number and the source and let his team reconstruct the connection rather than handing it to him in a form that would open doors she wasn't ready to open. But the honest answer also involved something simpler. She had received a call from this number 11 days ago. She had not answered it. She had saved it in her phone under a name she'd given it herself. A name that was not a name at all, but a descriptor, because she'd recognized the number and hadn't known yet what to do with the recognition. She pulled out her phone, scrolled to the entry, turned the screen so Seung could see it. He read the descriptor she'd saved it under. He looked up at her. "How long have you known?" he said. 11 days, she said. "I didn't know what I had. I knew it was connected to something I'd seen during my service, but I didn't have the full picture." She held his gaze. "I have more of the picture now." Seung looked at the phone for another moment, then at her. "We're going to need everything you know," he said. "I know." She picked up her phone. "I'm going to need something from you first." "What?" "I need to know that the people at Renner Institute, the patients, that they're not going to spend 6 months in a federal holding pattern while this gets litigated. I need to know that the equipment situation is being corrected now, not after the case resolves." Seung looked at her. He was not a man who made promises he wasn't sure he could keep. She could see him measuring the commitment. "I'll make a call," he said. "I can't promise an outcome, but I can promise a call." "Make it today." "Yes." She nodded. She looked at the piece of paper on the table, looked at the number that had been saved in her phone for 11 days, the number she'd found in documents she wasn't supposed to have retained from a situation that was sealed, the number that connected a Route 9 rockfall in October rain to a medical consulting firm in Billings, to 31 months of equipment being stripped from people who needed it to recover from injuries they'd earned. The name she'd saved it under was 2 words: Renner Inside. She'd known there was someone inside the network for 11 days. She'd been sitting on it, carrying it through Montana in her truck with Ranger in the back seat, not knowing what to do with a single phone number and the shape of a thing she couldn't prove. Now she had the proof. Now she had Seung. And now... She looked at her phone, at the log of incoming calls, at the date 11 days ago and the number and the fact that she'd never answered. She understood that whoever owned that number had called her for a reason, not randomly, not by mistake. They had called her specifically, which meant they knew who she was, which meant they'd known 11 days ago that the investigation was converging on a person with a sealed file and a P.O. box in Billings, and a dog named Ranger, and 6 hours of highway between her and a town called Harlow. She put the phone down on the table. She looked at Seung. "Who else," she said carefully, "has access to the DCIS case file on Meridian?" Seung's expression did the thing it had done in the break room, the controlled shift, the recalibration. "That file has restricted access," he said. 12 authorized personnel, including anyone connected to the VA network. A pause. "The VA network has a liaison position in the oversight structure," he said. "Standard interagency protocol." She looked at him. He looked at her. The room got very quiet in the specific way that rooms get quiet when both people in them have just arrived at the same understanding and neither of them has said it yet. "Seung," she said. "Yeah." "Someone in your oversight structure has been watching this case." She kept her voice even. "And 11 days ago, they called me, a civilian with a sealed file and a connection to Renner Institute that isn't in any accessible record." She paused. "That means they have access to records that aren't accessible." Seung picked up his phone. Not to call. To look at it, to look at the screen, to give himself 3 seconds in which to absorb what she'd just laid in front of him. "If the liaison position is compromised," he said slowly, "then whoever you've been reporting your case progress to..." She stopped. She didn't need to finish the sentence. Seung was already standing up. Seung made 3 calls in the next 7 minutes, standing in the middle of room 6 at the Harlow Inn, and Nora listened to all 3 without pretending not to. The first was to Marlowe. Short, clipped, the kind of call that communicates urgency through compression, rather than volume. Case integrity issue. Liaison access. Yes, now. Lock the file. He was off in 40 seconds. The second was to someone she didn't know. A supervisor, she gathered, above the field level. Someone who had to be read in on the possibility that their interagency oversight structure had a problem. This call lasted longer and had more silence in it. The kind of silence on a phone call that means the person on the other end is absorbing something they don't want to absorb. The third call was the one he'd promised her. She heard Renner Institute. She heard supply chain audit, immediate prioritization, patient care impact. She heard the word today used 3 times. When he hung up from the third call, he looked at her and said, "Someone will be at Renner by 5 p.m. She nodded. Arriaga had been sitting quietly with the recording equipment the entire time, not running it, just present in the particular way of someone who has understood that they are witnessing something that has expanded beyond the scope of what they came to document. "The liaison position," Seung said. He sat back down. He was tired in the visible way now, the controlled professional surface wearing thin at the edges. "It's held by a rotating appointment from the VA Oversight Board. The current holder has been in the position for—" He checked something on his phone. 14 months. Who appointed them? The board chair. And the board chair is, "We're going to need to be careful about how we move on this." He looked at her. "If we make noise too fast, they run. If the VA oversight structure is compromised at the appointment level, these people have institutional cover and legal resources, and they will use the 14 minutes of warning we give them to make a significant portion of this very difficult to prosecute." She understood that. She understood it, and it sat badly with her, the way the procedural reality of justice always sits badly against the simpler reality of what was done and to whom. 11 days, she said. Seung looked at her. "They called me 11 days ago. That means 11 days ago, someone in your oversight structure was already trying to manage their exposure. They'd identified me as a potential variable, someone with a connection to Renner, with a sealed file that they'd accessed without authorization, with enough of a picture to be dangerous." She looked at him. "They called me. Why?" Seung was quiet. "They weren't warning me," she said. "They were assessing me, seeing if I'd pick up, seeing what I knew. If I'd answered that call—" She stopped. "If I'd answered, they would have known exactly how much of a threat I was. And because you didn't answer, they didn't know. They were still calculating." She looked at the phone on the table. "Until last night. Until Cole described me to your team this morning and the question of who I was went into the system." She paused. "How long before whoever holds the liaison position sees that query?" "If the access controls are still intact, the query was flagged when I locked the file 20 minutes ago. They won't see anything new." He paused. "But anything they already saw, any queries run before I locked it, would have included whatever Cole's team ran on my name last night." Seung's jaw tightened slightly. "Yes." She stood up. "Then they already know I'm in Harlow," she said. "And they know I've been talking to you." Mutt. Hargrove took the information the way he took most difficult information, without visible reaction, processing it into action before the reaction had time to form. She told him in the parking lot of the Harlow Inn, standing beside her truck, Seung to her left, and the mountains to the north still carrying their snow indifferently. He made one call. Then he said, "The board chair's name is Warren Pell. He's been on the VA Oversight Board for 6 years. His background is in healthcare administration. He ran a regional hospital network in Idaho before the board appointment." A pause. "He also sits on the advisory board of Meridian Logistics Solutions." She looked at him. "That's public record," he said. "It's in Meridian's incorporated filings. It was in the documents on the drives. We had his name last night and didn't know what we had." "You had 41 line items and 11 facilities," she said. "You were building up. Now we're building down." He looked at Seung. "How fast can you get a federal warrant?" "Depends on the judge and the paperwork. If I have Marlowe drafting right now—" Seung checked the time. 3 hours, maybe 2. "Then start." Seung was already walking. Hargrove looked at her. "Warren Pell has a house in Billings and an office in Helena. He's not a field operative. He's an administrator who provided institutional cover and access to an organization that was running a supply diversion scheme. His role was access and protection, not execution. He paused. Which means he's going to behave like an administrator when this closes in. He's going to lawyer up, he's going to negotiate, he's going to try to trade what he knows about Meridian's broader network for a better outcome. Will it work? Depends on what he knows. He looked at her steadily. But whatever deal he makes, it happens inside a federal process. It doesn't happen because he ran. She looked at him. You're telling me this is going to take time?
Some of it, yes. The patients at Renner Institute have already waited 31 months. I know. That's not... She stopped herself, looked at the mountain, took a breath. I know how it works. I just need to say that it's not acceptable, even if it's the process. I know it's not acceptable. His voice was level. That's why we're standing in a parking lot in Harlow at 3 in the afternoon instead of going home. She looked at him. The tiredness was there in his face. Not the performance of it, the real kind, the kind that settles into the skin after a certain number of consecutive hours. He'd been running as long as she had, and he didn't have a bath and a 2-hour sleep in a room with brown carpet to credit. She thought about what it cost him to be this. Not the rank or the position. The person inside it, who had processed her separation papers and had looked at her this entire time with something he'd never named and that she'd never given him room to name, and who was still here, running on gas station coffee, trying to close a case that had kept growing. Warren Pell is going to find out the file is locked in the next few hours, she said. When he does, what does he do? We're watching his phone and his movement. If he runs, he won't run. He'll make calls. He'll consolidate. She thought about it. He'll also try to reframe. He'll build the version of events where he was an advisory board member with no operational knowledge of what Meridian was actually doing. He'll make it a civil question instead of a criminal one. He can try. He'll almost succeed if the evidence from the drives isn't airtight on his specific involvement. Hargrove looked at her. Why do you say that? Because men like Pell don't touch the operational layer. They're insulation. They sit on advisory boards and approve contracts and provide legitimacy and make sure the right oversight channels are slow to respond. What connects them to the crime is the access and the benefit. But the access looks like a normal board appointment, and the benefit is buried in corporate structures. She paused. What do the drives have on him specifically? Communications. Internal Meridian system messages, us. We have 12 that reference his position, his access, his awareness of the discrepancy between listed and actual supply values. Awareness isn't direction. No, but conspiracy doesn't require direction. It requires knowing. He held her gaze. And we have 12 messages that show he knew. She nodded. Let that sit. The case was real. The evidence was real. The process was going to be slow and imperfect, and the lawyers were going to make it messy, and some of the charges would stick more firmly than others, and the outcome wouldn't look like justice looks in the version of events people imagine when they use that word. But it was going to happen. She'd learned the difference, in the years since she'd come back, between what she wanted and what was possible. She'd learned it badly. Through the specific education of wanting something clean and getting something complicated and having to decide whether complicated was still worth it. She'd decided most days that it was. Most days. Okay, she said. Okay? I'll stay available. Whatever Seong needs, whatever your team needs, I'll provide it. She looked at him. But I need something. What? When Pell is charged, when this goes public, I want Renner Institute's supply situation corrected first, before the press, before the institutional announcements, before anyone is explaining the scheme to news cameras. She held his gaze. The people recovering at that facility should not find out that their equipment was being stolen from them through a news report. Hargrove was quiet for a moment. I'll make that happen, he said. She believed him. Shoot. Warren Pell was arrested at his Helena office at 8:47 a.m. on a Thursday, 3 days after Route 9, 41 hours after the DCIS file lock, 18 hours after the federal warrant was signed by a judge in the district court. He was charged with conspiracy to commit fraud against the United States government, obstruction of a federal investigation, and unauthorized access to restricted federal records.
Nora was not there for the arrest. She was in Billings. She'd driven down from Harlow the morning of the day before, after Seung told her the warrant was being finalized and the timeline was solid. She'd driven the 6 hours with Ranger in the back seat, and the mountains giving way to the high plains and Billings coming up on the horizon the way it always did. Flat skyline, rim rocks to the north, the particular scale of a city that is the largest thing for a long way in every direction. She went to Renner Institute first. The VA audit team had arrived the afternoon before as Seung promised, and the facility's supply situation was already in emergency correction mode. Direct purchase orders placed, priority delivery arranged, the specific items that had been most critically diverted flagged for same-week replacement. The director of Renner, a woman named Dr. Patricia Osei, who had apparently been requesting supply chain audits for 8 months and being told the system showed no anomalies, met Nora in the facility's small conference room and looked at her for a long moment before saying anything. "You were the one who found it," Osei said. "I found a document in a parking lot during a rainstorm. A lot of people found the rest." Osei looked at her with the particular expression of someone who is not going to argue with a deflection, but is also not accepting it as the full truth. 14 of my patients have been in extended recovery timelines because of equipment inadequacy. I've had 3 physicians leave in the past year because they couldn't do their jobs properly. I filed 8 supply complaints that went nowhere. She paused. 8 months of nowhere. And then 3 days. Nora didn't have an answer for that. She didn't try to construct one. "I'm sorry it took this long," she said. It was inadequate. She knew it was inadequate. But inadequate and true was better than the alternative. Osei nodded slowly. "Will you tell me, the patients here, will they be told what happened, who it affected, and how?" "That's your decision to make. But yes, I think they should know." "So do I." Osei stood. "I've been trying to protect them from the institutional embarrassment of it, but they're adults who served this country and were failed by a system that was supposed to care for them. They deserve the honest version." Nora stood too. "Yes, they do." She didn't go to her P.O. box that day. She drove instead to a part of Billings she knew, a neighborhood on the west side, streets she could navigate without thinking, a house with a blue door that she had driven past exactly twice in 14 months without stopping. She stopped this time. She sat in the truck for 4 minutes. Ranger watched her from the back seat. She got out. The woman who opened the door was her mother, 63, smaller than Nora remembered her from before the deployments, the specific diminishment of someone who has spent years worrying and has worn some of themselves down in the process. She looked at Nora, and her face did several things at once, and then she stepped back and held the door open. Nora went inside. She didn't explain Route 9 or Harlow or the hospital or the drives or any of it. She sat at the kitchen table and drank the coffee her mother made. Real coffee, not gas station, not burned. And they talked about ordinary things for an hour in the careful way of people who have been at a distance and are relearning proximity. It was halting and imperfect, and her mother cried briefly at one point without explaining why, and Nora let her and didn't try to resolve it, just sat there and was present. That was also a thing she'd been learning, that being present was sometimes the entire job. She stayed for 3 hours. When she left, her mother stood at the blue door and watched the truck pull away, and Nora watched her in the rear-view mirror until the turn took her out of sight. She drove back toward the rim rocks, parked, sat with the window down and the cold air coming in off the high plains, and Ranger's weight shifting in the back seat as he resettled himself. She thought about what 14 months of driving had been. She told herself it was decompression, necessary distance between the person she'd been in the sealed file and the person she was trying to become in civilian life. That was partially true. The other part, the part she'd been less honest about, was that distance is easier than proximity when proximity involves people who saw you leave and have been watching for you to come back, and you don't know yet who you're coming back as. She knew more now. Not everything, but enough to start. The public indictments came 8 days later. Warren Pell, Malcolm Strick, Petra Cole, whose real name, released as part of the federal charging documents, was Diane Voss,
a former pharmaceutical sales operative who had been working for Meridian under constructed identities at multiple facilities for 3 years. Robert Calloway. 4 additional Meridian executives, 2 logistics coordinators at other facilities, a total of 11 individuals across 3 states. The indictment documents ran to 260 pages. Nora read them in a motel room in Billings on the morning they were released, sitting on the edge of a bed with Ranger at her feet and the document open on her laptop, reading at the pace of someone who has been waiting for this particular accounting and is going to read every page of it. The scope was larger than the ledger had suggested, 41 facilities, 31 months at the broadest end, 17 at the narrowest. The total diversion was estimated at $47 million, of which approximately $12 million had moved through facility-level administrators like Strick and Calloway, approximately $23 million had moved through the Meridian corporate structure, and approximately $12 million had moved through the VA oversight mechanism that Warren Pell had managed and protected. $47 million that should have been prosthetic limbs and neurological monitoring equipment and rehabilitation devices and IV consumables and surgical supplies, converted instead into shell transfers and holding structures and the particular comfortable insulation of men who had decided that institutional access was a resource to be monetized. She read it all. She felt the anger again, the same anger from the bathtub at the Harlow Inn, the same anger she'd been carrying in the truck for 11 days since a phone call she hadn't answered. It was cleaner now, the way anger gets clean when the thing that caused it has been named and addressed. Not gone. Present, but different. The distinction between anger that has nowhere to go and anger that has already done its work. She closed the laptop. Ranger looked up at her. "I know," she said. He put his chin back on his paws. Hargrove called that afternoon. "Pell's attorney is already in negotiation," he said. "He's offering cooperation on the broader Meridian network. There are connected operations in 2 other states we haven't touched yet. His team is trying to convert the federal charges into a cooperation agreement. Will it work? Partially. He'll likely avoid the maximum, but he's not avoiding federal time. The unauthorized records access charge alone carries mandatory minimums. And Strick's attorney abandoned the cooperation angle when they saw the case file. He entered a not guilty plea yesterday, which is his right, but his attorneys know the evidentiary situation. They're managing an outcome, not contesting the fundamental charges." A pause. He resigned from Cascade Valley the day after the indictments. The hospital board accepted it in a statement that I think qualifies as the most anodyne language ever used to describe someone being removed from a position before federal charges land on the building's letterhead. She almost said something, stopped herself. "Calloway entered a cooperation agreement this morning," Hargrove continued. "He named 2 additional Meridian contacts we didn't have. He's going to spend several years explaining himself to a federal judge, which is appropriate." Another pause, shorter. Cole, is contesting extradition on a separate identity issue that's going to take time to sort out. She's not going anywhere. Okay. The Renner supply situation. I know, I was there. Right. He paused. Patricia Osei called me yesterday. She wanted to know your contact information. Nora looked out the motel window at the Billings street, at the ordinary midday movement of a city going about its ordinary life. What did you tell her? That I'd pass along the request. Give her my number. All right. A pause that had weight to it. How are you doing? She thought about the answer with more honesty than she'd given it at the parking lot of Cascade Valley, when she'd said upright because it was true and because she didn't have more than that available. I came back to Billings, she said. Yeah? Went to see my mother. A beat of silence. He knew enough of her situation to understand what that meant. Not the details, but the shape of it, the distance, and the difficulty, and the choice to close some of that distance. Good, he said. Just that. Good. Don't make it a thing, Hargrove. I'm not making it a thing. You have a voice when you're making something a thing. I genuinely don't know what voice you're referring to. She almost smiled. It surprised her, the almost of it, the way it arrived before she'd prepared for it. Is there anything else you need from me on the case? Seung may have additional follow-up questions as the cooperation agreements generate new information. Nothing requiring your physical presence.
phone or video is fine. He paused. There may also be a commendation. She was quiet. From the post commander of the convoy unit, Corporal Reese's unit, they want to formally acknowledge your actions on Route 9 and at the hospital. I'm a civilian. Civilians receive commendations. I don't need a commendation. I didn't say you needed it. His voice was even. I said they want to give it, which is different. It's not about what you need. It's about what's accurate. You carried one of their people through the rain and kept 11 of their people alive. They want that on record. She looked at the window. Somewhere in her chest, in the place where the anger had been and was now something lower and quieter, something shifted. Not dramatically. Not the way it shifts in stories when a person receives the recognition they've been denied and it lands like resolution. More like the way ice shifts in March, that a sound, a change in the structure, something that was locked now slightly looser, and you notice it because you've been waiting for the season to change. Okay, she said. Okay? Tell them okay. She heard him exhale. I'll pass that along. She ended the call. 2 weeks after the indictments, on a Tuesday morning in November, Nora Vasquez drove to Renner Institute and met with 3 patients that Patricia Osei had asked her to speak with. She hadn't prepared anything. She didn't have a speech. She told Osei she wasn't good at speeches, and Osei had said she wasn't asking for one. She was asking for presence, for the patients to meet the person who'd found the document in the rain, because sometimes the abstract fact of someone did something becomes more real when you can look at the person and they can look back at you. The 3 patients were at different stages of recovery, with different injuries, from different deployments. One was in a wheelchair. One walked with a cane. One appeared outwardly intact in the way that people with neurological injuries sometimes do. The wound not visible until you know to look for the specific compensation patterns. They'd been told the broad outline of what had happened and who she was, and why the supply situation was now being corrected. She sat in the room with them for an hour. She didn't try to make it into anything. She answered questions when asked, sat in the silences when there were silences, didn't perform gratitude or heroism or any of the narratives that the situation could have been decorated with. The woman in the wheelchair, her name was Torres, which was a coincidence that nobody commented on, asked her at one point, "Why did you stop on Route 9? You could have just kept driving." Nora thought about the honest answer. "I heard something," she said, "and that was enough?" She thought about it more carefully. About the 6 hours of driving, about the gas station, about the pressure in her sternum and Ranger going still in the truck bed and the decision that wasn't really a decision, the body moving before the mind had voted. "I wasn't going to be able to keep driving after that," she said. "That's not a noble answer. It's just the true one. Some things, once you've registered them, you can't unknow." Torres looked at her for a moment. "Yeah," she said, "I know that feeling." Nora thought she probably did. She left Billings on a Friday. Not running this time. Not the shapeless movement of someone putting distance between themselves and something they couldn't name. She had Osei's number in her phone, and her mother's number, and Seong's and Hargrove's, and the address of the Harlow Inn in a notes file she hadn't deleted. She had a P.O. box she was going to keep because it was practical, and a mother she was going to visit more frequently because that was a decision she'd made in the kitchen over real coffee. And she had the particular orientation of someone who has learned something about what she's for. She'd learned it in a ditch on Route 9 in the rain, and in a hospital corridor with a man in a suit blocking her path, and in a service yard at midnight with her knee in someone's back and a black case in her hand, and in a break room with bad coffee talking to a woman named Beverly who'd said people are going to be thinking about this for a while, and then left before Nora had to respond. She'd learned it over 14 months of highway and motel rooms and distance, which was its own education even if it hadn't felt like one. She didn't have a destination. That was still true. But there was a difference now between not having a destination and being lost. She understood the difference the way you understand things that have been true for a while but have only recently become legible to you. She was moving, but moving from something was not the same as moving with something, and she was moving with something now. Ranger put his head on the center console. She put her hand on his head. The highway ran north into mountains, then west, then south, then wherever it went next, and she didn't need to know the specific coordinates of where she was heading to know that she was heading somewhere real. The woman who had walked through the doors of a hospital in the rain and been told she didn't belong there was driving a truck with her dog, and the long, straight knowledge that belonging is not something you ask for at a reception desk, or wait for someone to confirm or accept when they finally condescend to recognize it. You carry it with you. You carry it in your hands at the moment when someone's life is in your hands, and your training is moving through you faster than your doubt. And you carry it in the refusal to explain yourself to people who have decided the category before they've looked at the contents. And you carry it in the quiet of a break room at 2 a.m. when the crisis is over and you're still there. You carry it the way you carry a person across your shoulders through the rain. Not because someone gave you permission, and not because someone will thank you for it, but because the thing in front of you needs doing, and you know how to do it, and that, in the end, is all the authorization that the moment requires. The highway opened up ahead of her. She drove.